Imagine you walk away from a crash with a fully loaded tractor trailer. Maybe you're at the crash scene and you feel a surge of adrenaline. You have a lot of energy and you feel relieved, even though you feel like you're in a little bit of shock. You go to the emergency room, taken by ambulance, and when you get there, they ask you a bunch of questions. Did you hit your head? Did you lose consciousness? And all you're thinking about is your pain in your leg or maybe your back or your neck, something that's throbbing. And you can't quite remember whether you actually did lose consciousness. And so you said, I don't think so. But just to be safe, the emergency room gives you a head CT scan. And then they tell you that it's normal and they release you from the hospital. But a few weeks later, you start noticing that you can't quite remember some conversations that happened. Maybe you have a short fuse. Your vision seems off. And your family members and spouse say, you know what, something doesn't seem quite right. But in some ways, you feel normal and you don't notice what everyone's complaining about. This happens frequently with mild traumatic brain injuries. It's something I want to talk about today, and I want to see if I can maybe provide some information that may help you realize if perhaps you may have sustained a mild traumatic brain injury in a crash. Hi, I'm Bob Byrne. I'm a Virginia attorney, and I handle primarily crashes involving large trucks, fully loaded tractor trailers, commercial dump trucks, box trucks, you name it. And oftentimes those collide with families and others in private passenger vehicles. And because of the huge size disparities and the weight and the forces that happen with those crashes, oftentimes people sustain brain injuries when they collide with a tractor trailer. So let's jump right in. There's actual medical literature that shows that emergency room professionals, and these are doctors and well-trained professionals, miss a traumatic brain injury diagnosis more than half of the time. And really what it comes down to, an emergency room exists to make sure that you don't have some sort of injury that is life-threatening, that's going to kill you immediately, like a heart attack, a stroke, internal bleeding, things like that. So doctors will look, and if they think that you may have hit your head or sustained some sort of head trauma, they'll give you what's called a CT scan. And a CT scan is something that's going to look inside your brain, and the doctors are going to look for visible signs of trauma, usually bleeding, because if there's internal bleeding in your brain, that could be a major problem. But the problem is a CT scan or an MRI can only show major structural damage. It can't show what's happening on a cellular level. And that's why if you've ever seen the movie Concussion starring Will Smith, it talks about how all these football players who were sustaining these head injuries over and over and over again, you couldn't see that they were having any type of brain trauma. But once they passed away and you looked underneath a microscope, you could see all of the trauma that had occurred. And that goes to show you how only with a microscope can you see some of this damage. And a CT scan or an MRI is not fine-tuned enough to be able to see that damage, and it can only be seen under a microscope. So a lot of times what happens with a mild traumatic brain injury, and this could be a concussion, is that the cells in the brain called axons shear. And that happens on a microscopic level. And those cells are damaged. And that starts a process that modern medicine says is actually a disease process more so than just an injury. And so when this process starts, there's chemicals that are released. There's all of these secondary effects that happen that can actually worsen over time. So with some folks, they may overcome a concussion within months of the event. But there is known in medicine what's called the miserable minority. And the miserable minority is a large percentage of people who have symptoms that exist for a long period of time and they don't get better. So to really understand some of the symptoms and some of the telltale signs of a mild traumatic brain injury, it's important to understand the brain's geography or the anatomy of the brain. So think of it this way. The brain has different sections. There's different domains, and those domains impact different areas of the body and different bodily functions. So think of your brain as a central computer system, and it directs different parts of your body, really every part of your body. So you have the frontal lobe of your brain, for instance, and that's going to impact decision making, what we call executive functioning, and impulse control. There's the temporal lobe, and that controls memory, that controls language. There's the occipital lobe of the brain, which controls vision. There's the cerebellum, which controls balance and coordination. There's the brainstem, which controls sleep and arousal and functions like that. And these are just some of those areas that are in the brain, some of the major components. And when there's an injury to one of those domains, the bodily functions that are controlled by that domain are going to be impacted, and there's going to be symptoms as a result. Let's talk about 4 general areas of brain injury symptoms. And the first we'll call physical symptoms. And physical symptoms can be headaches, and that's one of the greatest telltale signs of a mild traumatic brain injury is when you have these trauma-induced headaches that can be deep and intractable and can be really problematic and can interfere with life. There could be dizziness or balance issues, certain levels of fatigue that just don't improve with rest. You could have sleep disturbances, either inability to fall asleep, inability to stay asleep, all of these sorts of issues. A second type of traumatic brain injury symptoms are sensory systems. So think of issues with your vision, such as double vision, inability to focus, perhaps issues with hearing. We have a lot of folks who we represent who have tinnitus, which is ringing in the ear, and it's just this ringing that is so distracting, and they cannot overcome it no matter what. We have a lot of brain injury survivors who notice changes in their taste, changes in their smell, and there's certain things that they can't smell any longer, and that could be particularly dangerous if they can't smell smoke, if they can't smell kind of that sulfur smell when there's natural gas that is running. A third area of symptoms for a mild traumatic brain injury are what are called cognitive symptoms. And these could be memory issues where you either have loss of memory of things that happened just minutes before or perhaps things from long ago. You could have difficulty concentrating, difficulty making connections in thoughts and ideas. A lot of our clients report having word-finding difficulty. They have never had problems before communicating, and now they can't really articulate what it is that they're having problems with. We've had folks who are, white-collar workers who have to use computers, and they just cannot handle using the computer because some of the concentration issues, especially when compounded with the vision issues and the sensory issues, make it just impossible for them to look at the screen and focus on what they're doing. A fourth area of symptoms for traumatic brain injury survivors that we routinely see and that's recognized by medicine are emotional symptoms. It's very common for family members to report that someone is having emotional outbursts. So they have a temper where they've never had that before. They lose patience very, very quickly. They feel irritated easily. They have anxiety. They have depression. They're having all of these mood and emotional swings that they've never experienced before. This can cause also personality changes, cause people to withdraw from social settings and social functions. And it can cause someone who's somewhat extroverted to become much more reserved and introverted. One of the things that's so tricky about this is that when you are someone, perhaps, and you have sustained a traumatic brain injury, you may not even recognize that you have some of these symptoms. I mean, if you think about it, your brain's not working quite right, so you really don't even recognize, perhaps, that your memory is off. You just don't even recognize that it's happened. You may not notice that you are having emotional outbursts and you think, man, my family's just being particularly annoying right now. Or you may think that it's just due to increased stress. And you may not notice those things, but your loved ones may. Spouses can recognize these. Kids can recognize these things. And so if you're in a situation where you are hearing your spouse complain repeatedly about ways that you're acting, that you just don't seem to have any enjoyment about things since this crash, that you seem to be emotionally out of control, that you're exhausted, that you're forgetting things, that you're making mistakes that you've never made before, you need to listen to those things. And if you are that spouse or those children, it's important that you point these things out and maybe go and see a brain injury specialist who might be able to tie these things together and make a proper diagnosis where one had been missed before. So in sum, if you are in a position where you're noticing that you're experiencing some symptoms, or those closest to you are saying, you know what, we've seen some differences here, maybe you got to get these checked out. It's important for you to pay attention to that. We've had clients who have seen brain injury specialists, and they will claim that the brain injury specialists are lifesavers and have changed their lives forever. And so there is hope and there is opportunity to get better, to deal with your symptoms, and to get on the right track. Brain injuries can be invisible, but the impact is very, very real. And if you are someone who has experienced a brain injury, or you suspect you may have, and you were involved in a crash, particularly with a tractor trailer or other commercial motor vehicle, feel free to give me a call. I can see if we can point you in the right direction. We handle these claims all the time. We know the medicine, we know the law, and we will see what we can do to point you in the right direction. But thanks so much for watching. If you haven't yet, please consider liking and subscribing, and please stay tuned for more videos. Thanks.